My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and I own a chain of 10 Japanese sushi restaurants that had become some of the most respected in the city. 3 weeks before I was supposed to leave for Japan for a 3-year training program, my family decided those 10 restaurants belonged to my brother. I found out at dinner. My father pushed a folder across the table and said, "Before you leave, you're signing the restaurants over to your brother." I stared at the papers. "Excuse me? You'll be gone for 3 years," he said. "Ryan needs something stable, and those restaurants were built while you were living under this roof. They're family assets." My mother nodded. "You'll still be learning in Japan. You can come back and start something new." I looked at my brother. He didn't ask what I thought. He simply said, "Dad already explained everything to me." That was when I understood this dinner had never been a discussion. I pushed the folder back. "No, I built those restaurants, and I'm not giving them away because I'm leaving the country to become better at what I do." My father's voice hardened. "Then don't blame us for what happens next." I didn't know what he meant. I also didn't know that within weeks, customers would begin accusing my restaurants of serving unsafe food, suppliers would receive unexpected payments, and someone would start sending messages that could destroy everything I had spent a decade building. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, how far away you are, and what time is it there? I want to know how many miles this story is traveling tonight. 10 years earlier, Emily had opened a tiny sushi counter on the east side of the city, using nearly every dollar she had saved from years of working double shifts at neighborhood restaurants. She had no investors, no family money, and no famous chef attached to her name. What she did have was a clear idea of what she wanted guests to experience, and the discipline to learn every part of the business herself. During the first year, she arrived before the kitchen crew, checked deliveries, prepared the opening list, and stayed until the last table was cleared. Hiring a reliable sushi chef proved harder than she expected. 2 cooks left within months, one because the hours were too demanding and another because he wanted a larger restaurant. Instead of closing early or cutting corners, Emily learned more of the preparation herself, then recruited a chef who cared about consistency as much as speed. Finding dependable seafood suppliers took even longer. She visited markets, compared invoices, questioned delivery schedules, and learned how temperature, timing, and handling could affect the quality of fish long before it reached a customer's plate. She also spent evenings studying food safety requirements and building storage procedures that her small team could actually follow. Her first menu was limited because she refused to offer dishes she could not execute properly. Customers noticed. Within months, regulars began bringing coworkers and relatives, and weekend reservations became difficult to get. Emily saved every dollar she could and put it back into the business. The second location opened 2 years after the first, not because she wanted a bigger name, but because the demand had become impossible to ignore. Ryan was already moving through a string of jobs by then. He had worked in sales, tried a short-lived online retail business, and later joined a startup that closed before his first year ended. Emily never treated his failures as proof that he could not succeed. When he needed help with rent, she covered it. When he wanted to try another business idea, she introduced him to one of her contacts. When he asked for a position at one of her restaurants, she gave him a chance in operations. Ryan lasted several months before complaining that the work was beneath him. Emily let him leave without turning it into a family argument. As her second restaurant stabilized, she opened a third, then a fourth. Each new location required another layer of disciplined training managers, standardizing preparation, negotiating supplier contracts, and making sure the quality remained consistent even when she was not physically present. By the time the fifth restaurant opened, local food writers had started mentioning her name. Emily used that attention carefully. She did not rush into franchising, and she rejected investors who wanted to expand faster than her systems could handle. Her goal was to build a restaurant group that could survive without sacrificing the standards that made customers return. Over the next several years, the same approach took her from 5 locations to 7, then 8, and eventually 10. The 10th restaurant opened in a busy downtown district and became the strongest performer in the group. By then, Emily had built a management team, established supplier relationships, created training manuals, and developed a reputation for demanding consistency without treating employees like machines. The sixth and seventh locations tested that structure more than the earlier openings had. Emily was no longer able to personally inspect every delivery or train every new employee, so she created a small quality team and required managers to document receiving temperatures, supplier changes, and kitchen incidents. She also learned to separate family loyalty from business decisions. When Ryan asked whether he could eventually manage one of the larger locations, Emily told him he would need to learn the operation from the ground up. He agreed for a while, then stopped showing up consistently. Their parents considered that unfair, but Emily did not change the standard. She offered him another chance later, this time in a paid management trainee role, and he left after 6 weeks. Even then, she did not cut him off completely. She simply stopped confusing support with entitlement. By the time the 10th location opened, Emily could see how much had changed since the tiny counter where she had started, and she knew the next stage required learning beyond anything available at home. Ryan's life had become less predictable. He had another business attempt that failed, followed by a period when he depended heavily on their parents. Emily still helped when she could, but she stopped handing him money without asking what the money was for. That change created tension, although no one openly discussed it. For Emily, the restaurants had become more than profitable businesses. They were a system she had spent a decade building piece by piece, and she knew exactly how fragile that system could become if someone inexperienced took control of it. That was one reason her plans for Japan mattered so much. Emily had spent years mastering the American side of the business, but she wanted to understand Japanese sushi culture at a deeper level. She had contacted chefs and training programs in Japan, studied their methods, and eventually secured a place in a 3-year professional program. The training would cover traditional sushi preparation, fish handling, knife technique, omakase service, restaurant management, and sourcing relationships. She also wanted to spend time learning how respected Japanese restaurants protected quality across generations rather than chasing rapid expansion. Emily planned to leave day-to-day operations with the management team she had trained, while she focused on learning and building relationships that could strengthen the restaurants when she returned. She had already mapped out the first year, arranged housing, completed the required paperwork, and scheduled meetings with the chefs who would oversee her training. Her flight was booked, the final documents were signed. A few days later, while Emily was finishing the last details before leaving, her phone filled with notifications from one of her restaurant managers. At first, she assumed there had been a scheduling problem. Then she opened the first message and saw a post accusing one of her restaurants of serving unsafe food. 4 days later, the first accusation appeared online. A customer posted that one of Emily's restaurants had served fish that looked spoiled, claiming the seafood had been stored at unsafe temperatures and should never have reached a customer's table. The post included 3 photographs and a short video from inside a kitchen area. Emily read it twice before calling the restaurant manager. She expected an ordinary complaint, something that could be checked and corrected if necessary. Instead, the manager told her 2 more customers had already asked for refunds. Within an hour, the post was being shared across local food groups. Other accounts repeated the accusation, some adding claims about raw tuna, salmon, and shellfish that Emily had never seen in any of her kitchens. A video appeared showing trays of seafood beside a caption warning people to stay away from the entire chain. Reservations began disappearing from the booking system. Employees forwarded screenshots of customers canceling birthday dinners and business lunches. The phones at several locations kept ringing, and managers were being asked whether the restaurants were under investigation. Emily stopped packing for Japan. She called the managers of all 10 locations and gave them the same instruction: preserve every record and do not argue with customers online. She wanted the receiving logs, supplier invoices, delivery schedules, storage temperature records, inspection reports, and security footage from each restaurant. No one was allowed to delete or alter anything, even if a manager believed a document was irrelevant. By late afternoon, Emily was at the first location herself. She went directly into the receiving area and checked the current seafood inventory with the kitchen manager. The fish had been delivered according to the scheduled order, and the receiving records showed the temperatures recorded when the shipment arrived. She compared those numbers with the restaurant's storage logs, then checked the supplier invoice against the delivery manifest. Nothing matched the story spreading online. She moved through the kitchen, asking the staff when each shipment had arrived, who had received it, and whether anyone outside the regular team had entered the storage area during the previous week. The answers were consistent. The same checks were repeated at the second and third locations, where the records also showed normal deliveries and documented storage procedures. The financial damage, however, was already becoming difficult to contain. A corporate lunch was canceled. A weekend reservation block disappeared. One manager called to say an employee had been confronted by a customer who demanded to know why the restaurant was allegedly serving unsafe food. Emily instructed every manager to remain calm, cooperate with legitimate questions, and avoid making statements that could interfere with any formal inspection. That evening, she reviewed the photographs from the original post again. Something bothered her. The pictures were not taken from the dining room or from a position a normal customer could reach. One showed the interior of a refrigerated storage area. Another captured a section of shelving that was normally behind a restricted door. Emily called the manager from the first restaurant. Who had access to that storage room? The manager paused before answering. Employees assigned to receiving, the kitchen manager, our regional operations staff, and anyone with management access. Anyone else? There were a few temporary access permissions over the past year. I can pull the list. Emily waited while he checked the system. He read the names one by one, then stopped. There's one more, he said. Who? Ryan. Emily said nothing. The manager continued. He had temporary access during one of the inventory reviews. It was never removed from the system. Emily asked him to send the complete access record immediately. A minute later, her phone received the file. Ryan's name was there. At another location, a manager found that Ryan's old access permission was still attached to the system there as well. That did not prove he had entered the storage room. But it changed the questions Emily needed answered. She asked each manager to preserve the access logs before anyone could accidentally overwrite older records. Meanwhile, the public reaction continued to grow. A local parenting group shared the original accusation, and several customers began asking whether the health department had inspected the restaurants. One customer posted a photograph of a canceled reservation and wrote that she would never return. Another demanded a statement from Emily personally. Emily refused to respond with an emotional defense. She issued a short message confirming that the company was preserving its records and cooperating with any official review. She did not accuse anyone, deny facts she had not yet verified, or identify the person whose access had appeared in the logs. The damage continued. 2 suppliers called to ask whether they should pause deliveries. A downtown manager reported that a private event had been postponed. Another location had to move several employees off the evening schedule because reservations had dropped sharply. Emily spent the night comparing the original photographs with the layouts of the 10 restaurants. The shelving shown in one image matched the first location. A second photograph appeared to show a storage corridor used only by management and receiving staff. She asked the manager whether the corridor had ever been photographed for marketing purposes. He said no. She asked whether the supplier had taken the pictures during a delivery. Again, no. Then Emily opened the access record one more time. Ryan's name appeared beside the recent entry. She still did not call him. Instead, she saved the file, requested the remaining logs from all 10 locations, and asked her assistant to preserve every message connected to the accusation. The next step would require more than suspicion, and Emily knew that whatever had happened inside those storage rooms had left a trail somewhere. For now, she had only one confirmed fact. Someone had used access that should have been limited, and Ryan's name was attached to it 3 days before the scandal began. That afternoon, Emily asked her secretary to pull every payment connected to the restaurant suppliers. She did not call Ryan, and she did not ask her parents for an explanation. Instead, she wanted the records first. Her secretary, Lauren, opened the company's accounting system and began exporting payment histories from the previous 6 months. They started with supplier invoices, then matched them against bank transfers, refunds, credits, and recurring service charges. At first, everything looked ordinary. The restaurants paid for seafood, produce, packaging, cleaning services, and routine maintenance on schedules that matched their contracts. Lauren marked each transaction that had a missing invoice, an unfamiliar recipient, an unusual amount, or a payment date that did not fit the normal delivery cycle. Most of the entries had simple explanations. A manager had paid an emergency repair bill. One supplier had issued a credit after a late delivery. Another payment had been recorded under a slightly different company name because the vendor had changed its billing system. Emily stayed at her desk while Lauren worked through the list, asking questions only when a transaction needed clarification. By early evening, they had narrowed hundreds of entries down to a small group that deserved a closer look. The first pattern appeared in the dates. Several payments to food suppliers had been made 1 or 2 days before the online accusations appeared. None of the payments were large enough to stand out on a monthly financial report, but their timing was unusual. Lauren opened the corresponding invoices and compared them with delivery records. In 3 cases, the invoice dates did not line up with the actual deliveries. One supplier had received a payment before any order had been entered into the restaurant system. Another had been paid for a service that no manager remembered requesting. Emily asked Lauren to trace the recipients instead of assuming the transactions were mistakes. The money did not lead directly to anyone in Emily's family. One payment went to a small consulting company that handled administrative services for local businesses. Another went to an individual whose name appeared on an old vendor contact list. A third payment was sent to a supplier through a separate account that the restaurant had never used before. Lauren created a spreadsheet that connected each payment to its original source, date, recipient, invoice, and related restaurant. She then checked whether the same names appeared in other transactions. The consulting company had received 2 small payments from a family-owned account that was not part of Emily's restaurant operation. That account belonged to someone Emily recognized as a longtime acquaintance of her parents. Lauren did not make assumptions. She went back through the records and checked the dates again. The first payment had been made the day before a complaint appeared online. The second came shortly before another post was shared. A separate transfer to the seafood supplier had been processed less than 24 hours before a photograph accusing the restaurant of mishandling fish began circulating. Emily leaned closer to the screen. "Could those payments be unrelated?" she asked. Lauren nodded. "They could. That's why I'm checking everything twice." She opened the supplier's account information and compared the recipient details with the company's historical records. The account number was different from the one normally used for restaurant payments. The name on the account looked familiar, but the business address belonged to another company. Lauren searched the public business records available to the company and found that the second company shared a mailing address with a local services firm. She then compared that address with old vendor paperwork. The same address appeared on a contact document Emily's parents had once provided when recommending a service provider. Emily did not react immediately. She asked Lauren to keep going. Another payment surfaced from a different account. It was smaller than the others and had been processed through a payment service rather than a direct bank transfer. The recipient was an individual, not a business. Lauren traced the transaction through the payment reference and found that the same person had later transferred money to a food supplier used by one of Emily's downtown locations. The amounts were modest, but the sequence was becoming difficult to dismiss. Lauren printed the transaction dates and placed them beside the corresponding online posts. She also added the supplier invoices and delivery dates. The pattern was not yet proof of wrongdoing, but it showed that several people connected to the restaurant supply chain had received unexpected payments immediately before accusations were published. Emily asked whether any of the payments had come from Ryan. Lauren checked the account names and transaction descriptions. "Not directly," she said. "I don't see his name anywhere." Emily remained quiet, then asked her to check family-related accounts without searching only for Ryan. Lauren expanded the review to accounts belonging to Emily's parents and businesses connected to people they regularly worked with. This produced another match. A small payment had been sent to the same administrative services company that appeared in the earlier transactions. The transfer description was only 4 words long. For the supplier issue, Lauren stopped scrolling. She opened the transaction details, checked the sender, then compared the date with the first accusation. The payment had cleared the afternoon before the post appeared. Lauren then separated the transactions by source rather than by supplier. That distinction mattered because the same outside names were appearing across different restaurants, even though the restaurants themselves had no reason to pay the same people. She checked whether any manager had approved the payments and found no matching authorization. She also reviewed the payment descriptions for similar wording. Most were ordinary references such as invoice numbers or delivery codes. The unusual entries were different. They used vague descriptions that did not identify a product, shipment, or service. Emily asked her to save copies of the original records and preserve the timestamps before making any further changes to the accounting files. Lauren agreed and created a separate evidence folder for the documents she had reviewed. She did not yet know who had arranged the payments, but she now had enough information to keep digging without relying on assumptions. She looked at Emily and said, "There's something else. These payments all connect to people your family knows." The next morning, one of the suppliers asked to speak with Emily privately. He arrived before the lunch rush and asked whether they could talk somewhere away from the restaurant staff. Emily agreed, but she noticed immediately that he kept checking his phone and seemed reluctant to sit down. He had supplied seafood to several of her locations for years, and his name had appeared in the payment records Lauren had reviewed the previous evening. He placed his phone on the table but did not unlock it. "I need to tell you something," he said, "but I don't want my business caught in the middle." Emily told him that she would not ask him to make accusations he could not support. If he had records, she wanted the original copies. The supplier finally unlocked his phone and opened a message thread. At first, the conversation looked ordinary. There were questions about delivery times, invoices, and which restaurant would receive a shipment. Then the tone changed. A person acting as an intermediary asked whether he could provide photographs from inside one of the storage areas. The supplier had replied that he did not understand why anyone needed them. The response was short: "We need something that makes people believe there's a problem." Emily read the message again. She asked when it had been sent. The supplier gave her the date. It was 2 days before the first accusation appeared online. He then opened another thread. This one contained several messages from Ryan. Ryan never wrote that the restaurants should be destroyed, and he never directly instructed the supplier to lie about the food. Instead, he talked about pressure, timing, reputation, and a transfer. One message asked whether the supplier could help create some concern before Emily left the country. Another asked how quickly certain photographs could be circulated if they were needed. A third mentioned that the restaurant group would become much harder to manage once the owner was gone for several years. Emily kept reading without interrupting him. The supplier explained that he had initially believed Ryan was trying to protect a business arrangement. He said Ryan had spoken about taking over operations while Emily was away and had complained that she was making decisions that left the family with no control. The supplier did not know about the plan to force a transfer. He only knew that Ryan had become increasingly focused on the company's reputation. Then the supplier showed Emily a message that changed the context of everything they had already seen. It read, "Once the restaurants lose their reputation, she won't have a choice." The message had been sent from an account connected to Ryan, but the supplier had not replied to it directly. Instead, he had forwarded it to the intermediary who had originally approached him. Emily asked why he had kept the message. He said he became uncomfortable after seeing how quickly the accusations spread. He had also received money that did not match any legitimate order. He opened his banking records and showed her the deposits. None was large enough to attract immediate attention, but each appeared shortly before a new accusation was posted. One payment had been described as a consulting fee. Another had no meaningful description at all. A third had come through an account belonging to a small service company. Emily asked whether Ryan had personally paid him. The supplier shook his head. Not directly. He explained that the intermediary had told him the money would come through different accounts so that the payments would not look connected. Emily asked whether other suppliers had received similar instructions. The supplier hesitated before answering. "I believe so." He showed her another photograph. It was one of the images used in the online accusations, but the original file contained information that had been removed from the version posted publicly. The photograph had been taken inside a restricted storage area. Its timestamp placed it several days before the accusation appeared. Another file showed a different angle of the same shelving. Emily recognized the location immediately. She asked the supplier who had requested the photographs. He said the intermediary had asked for them and told him they would be used to document a concern. He had not realized they would be presented as proof that the restaurant had served unsafe food. Emily asked for the complete message history, not screenshots alone. The supplier handed over his phone and allowed Lauren to copy the relevant records. The messages showed a gradual escalation. First came questions about timing. Then came requests for photographs. After that came discussions about reputation and how long it might take for customers to stop trusting the restaurants. Finally, there were references to a transfer of control. No single message contained the entire plan, but together they formed a sequence that was difficult to ignore. The supplier also provided the payment records and the contact information for the intermediary. Emily asked Lauren to preserve everything exactly as received. Lauren began organizing the files by date and source. She noticed that several payments connected to the intermediary had already appeared in the accounting records she reviewed the day before. That gave the messages a financial trail. The payments were no longer isolated transactions. They were attached to conversations about photographs, timing, and the restaurant's reputation. Emily asked Lauren to check whether any family-related accounts had paid the intermediary or his service company. Lauren searched the records again, this time focusing on the names and account numbers connected to the supplier's documents. After several minutes, she found another transaction. It was not from Emily's restaurant accounts. It came from an account belonging to her parents. Lauren opened the transaction details and compared the date with the messages. The payment had been made shortly before the intermediary contacted the supplier. Emily stared at the screen. She did not call her parents. She did not call Ryan. She simply asked Lauren to save the record with the rest of the evidence. For the first time, the trail had moved beyond Ryan and the suppliers. Someone in Emily's own family had sent money to one of the people connected to the campaign against her restaurants. That evening, Emily asked her parents and Ryan to meet at the house. She waited until everyone was seated before placing a thick folder on the table. Lauren had organized the material by date, and Emily had separated the documents into payments, messages, supplier records, and copies of the posts that had caused the damage. She wanted the conversation anchored to facts rather than family arguments. Emily looked at Ryan and said, "I want you to explain these before I make any assumptions." Ryan barely glanced at the pages. His confidence seemed to disappear for a moment, but he recovered quickly and leaned back in his chair. "I already told you, I had nothing to do with the post." Emily slid the first message toward him. "Then explain why your account appears in this conversation." Ryan picked up the phone printout, read it, and placed it back down. "Those messages don't prove what you think they prove." Her father leaned forward. "You are misunderstanding what we were trying to do." Emily turned toward him. "Then tell me what you were trying to do." He hesitated. Her mother spoke before he could answer. "Your brother needed something to hold on to." Emily looked at her. "A restaurant chain?" "A future," her mother said. "You were leaving for 3 years. Ryan needed a chance to establish himself." Emily pointed to the payment record. "Was this part of that chance?" No one answered immediately. Ryan finally admitted that he had been talking to suppliers. He said he wanted to understand the business before Emily left. He claimed he had been asking questions because he was worried about what would happen during her absence, and he insisted that some of the conversations had been taken out of context. Emily asked him whether he had contacted the suppliers before or after the first accusations appeared. Ryan said it depended on which conversation she meant. He insisted he never intended to hurt anyone. Emily asked why he had discussed photographs, timing, and reputation with people outside the company. Ryan said he was frustrated. He had watched Emily build something he believed should have been shared with the family, and he felt that she was walking away from everyone who had supported her. Emily did not argue about who had helped whom. She knew the conversation could easily turn into a list of old favors, family sacrifices, and grievances that had nothing to do with the accusations. Instead, she kept returning to dates, payments, and decisions that had been made without her permission. Then she asked one question. "Did you pay people to make customers believe my restaurants were serving unsafe food?" Ryan looked toward their father. "I was trying to create pressure." "Pressure for what?" "For you to reconsider the transfer." Emily stared at him. Ryan continued before she could respond. "You still live with the family. You built the business while everyone was under the same roof. Dad helped when you were starting. Mom helped with the restaurants. You act like you did everything alone, but that's not true." Emily kept her voice steady. "Helping me is not the same as owning what I built." Ryan shook his head. "That's exactly the problem. You never see this as a family." Emily placed another document in front of him. It showed the timing of one of the payments and the accusation that followed. "This is not family support. This is a campaign against my business." Her father pushed the document away. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be." Emily turned to him. "Customers canceled reservations because of this. Employees are worried about their jobs. Suppliers are questioning whether they should keep working with us. You don't get to call that small, because you were not the one standing inside those restaurants." Her mother began crying quietly. Emily did not raise her voice. "I gave Ryan opportunities because he was my brother. I never gave him permission to damage my name." Ryan leaned back and said, "What was I supposed to do? You're leaving for Japan for 3 years. Those restaurants are going to need someone here. You won't be around." Emily answered. "That decision was never yours to make." Ryan's expression hardened. "If you leave for Japan, those restaurants will collapse anyway." The room went silent. Emily gathered the documents and looked directly at him. For several seconds, Ryan said nothing. His mother reached for his hand, but he pulled it back and stood. Emily stayed seated, waiting for him to answer. "Then I will decide what happens to them. Not you." She told her parents that the restaurants were not family property simply because she had lived in their home while building them. She said she would not sign a transfer, would not surrender management authority, and would not allow anyone to use her absence as a reason to take control. Her father warned her that involving outside authorities could destroy the family. Emily answered that the family had already crossed that line when someone decided her reputation was a tool for getting what they wanted. She would not protect anyone from consequences simply because they shared her last name. Ryan tried one final argument. He said he could repair the damage if she gave him control. Emily refused without changing her expression. She collected the evidence, placed it into a separate envelope, and called Lauren. She instructed her to preserve every original record and prepare copies for their attorney. Then Emily contacted her attorney herself and scheduled an urgent meeting for the following morning, before the restaurants opened. Before leaving the room, she looked at the folder her father had once used to demand the transfer. "You wanted me to sign away 10 restaurants because I was going to Japan," she said. "Instead, I'm going to make sure no one can take them from me while I'm gone." The following morning, Emily handed the evidence to investigators. She brought the message records, payment history, supplier information, copies of the photographs, and the supporting files Lauren had preserved. She did not try to explain the entire case herself. Instead, she answered each question and allowed the investigators to determine which records needed independent verification. A food safety inspection team was also assigned to review the restaurants. Their first step was to examine the storage areas connected to the allegations. Inspectors checked refrigeration temperatures, receiving logs, product labels, delivery records, and the condition of the seafood currently on site. They compared the information with supplier invoices and documented when each shipment had arrived. At several locations, they reviewed records from previous deliveries rather than relying only on what they saw that day. The investigators also examined the photographs that had circulated online. One image showed seafood containers that were allegedly being stored at unsafe temperatures. The inspection team compared the photograph with the restaurant's layout, storage equipment, and records from the date the image was supposedly taken. Another photograph was checked against the supplier documents and the documented delivery schedule. The images did not establish what the posts claimed they established. The team continued checking rather than dismissing the allegations immediately. They interviewed managers, receiving employees, and suppliers who had handled the shipments shown in the accusations. One supplier provided the original message history and payment records that had already been given to Emily. Another agreed to explain why money had been sent through an outside account shortly before the accusations appeared. Investigators compared those statements with the financial records and found inconsistencies between the alleged food problems and the documented supply chain. Meanwhile, the police began tracing the payments connected to the intermediary. They examined account ownership, transfer dates, transaction descriptions, and relationships between the recipients. The purpose was not simply to find Ryan's name. Investigators wanted to determine who had arranged the payments, who had received them, and whether the money was connected to the campaign that had damaged the restaurants. Emily remained outside that process. She continued managing the restaurants while the review moved forward. The financial damage had not stopped just because investigators were working. Reservations remained below normal. Several customers were still asking questions, and some suppliers wanted reassurance before continuing regular deliveries. Emily instructed her managers to cooperate with every legitimate request for information and to keep their operations consistent. She did not ask employees to defend the restaurants online or attack the people who had made the accusations. She wanted the official findings to speak for themselves. A few days into the inspection, the food safety team completed its review of the locations directly connected to the photographs. The records showed that the serious claims circulating online could not be substantiated by the inspection findings. The documented temperatures, supplier records, delivery histories, and available product information did not support the allegations that had spread across social media. The investigators still documented several ordinary operational issues that required attention, including paperwork that needed to be updated and one storage procedure that could be improved. Emily accepted those findings and instructed her managers to correct them immediately. She did not want the investigation to become a public relations exercise. She wanted the records to be accurate. The supplier who had come forward then provided additional material to investigators, including original messages, payment confirmations, and the contact information of the intermediary. That evidence gave the police a clearer route for following the money. The transfers led through several accounts before reaching people connected to the supplier network. Investigators also found that some of the payments had occurred shortly before the accusations were posted, which strengthened the connection they were examining. Ryan was now being questioned about his communications and financial relationships. His involvement was not treated as a conclusion. Investigators were building the case from records, statements, and independently verified information. Emily's father was also asked about payments from his account and his knowledge of the discussions surrounding the restaurants. He maintained that he had not intended for anyone to damage Emily's business. Investigators continued examining the evidence rather than accepting or rejecting his explanation immediately. Outside the investigation, the consequences for him were already becoming visible in the neighborhood. People who had trusted him as the neighborhood association leader began asking questions about his connection to the controversy. Some residents requested that he step aside until the matter was resolved. Within days, he resigned from his position as neighborhood association leader, saying he did not want the controversy to interfere with the community's work. The decision spread quickly among local residents. For Emily, however, the most important issue remained the restaurants. An official statement was eventually released confirming that the serious food safety allegations circulating online had not been supported by the inspection findings. The statement did not erase the damage. The 10 restaurants were still dealing with canceled reservations, reduced traffic, nervous customers, and employees who had spent weeks wondering whether their jobs were secure. Emily read the statement without celebrating. She forwarded it to her managers and told them to continue operating normally, answer customer questions honestly, and avoid speculation about the investigation. The public record had begun to separate the allegations from the verified facts, but rebuilding the trust that had been damaged would take longer. That evening, Emily reviewed the inspection report with Lauren and focused on practical steps ahead. They identified customers who needed follow-up, reservations that could be restored, and suppliers who needed updated documentation. Emily asked managers to keep inspection records and customer complaints organized so the restaurants could respond consistently. The investigation had changed the direction of the story, but it had not restored the business overnight. One location remained unusually quiet during dinner, while another corporate client postponed a future event. Meanwhile, investigators continued reviewing financial records connected to the intermediary and requested additional documents from another supplier. Emily provided every record requested and stayed out of the interviews. By the end of the week, the restaurants had inspection results, the police had a growing financial trail, and the public had an official statement. Yet several customers remained uncertain. 3 weeks later, Emily boarded the flight she had nearly canceled. She left the restaurants in the hands of the management team she had spent years training, with clear authority, written procedures, and regular reporting requirements. Japan was no escape from what had happened in America. It was the professional commitment she had chosen before everything changed, and she refused to let the scandal decide whether she would pursue it. During the first year, Emily immersed herself in traditional sushi preparation. She studied knife skills until precise cuts became part of her daily routine, learned how different fish responded to temperature and handling, and observed how experienced chefs prepared ingredients with almost no wasted movement. She spent long hours learning the discipline behind omakase service, where consistency depended on preparation long before a guest sat at the counter. Her training also changed the way she thought about management. The chefs she worked with did not separate food quality from business operations. Sourcing, storage, staff training, timing, and customer experience were treated as parts of the same system. Emily kept detailed notes and regularly compared what she was learning with the systems used in her restaurants back home. During the second year, she focused more heavily on sourcing and preservation. She met suppliers, learned how relationships were maintained over time, and studied how careful handling could protect both quality and reputation. She also observed restaurant owners who had spent decades refining a single concept instead of constantly chasing expansion. Those lessons changed one of her assumptions. Growth was not always about adding another location. Sometimes it meant making the existing locations better. During the third year, Emily moved deeper into restaurant management. She studied scheduling, training systems, service standards, purchasing controls, and methods for keeping quality consistent across multiple locations. She stayed in regular contact with her management team in America, reviewing performance reports and approving major decisions while leaving routine operations to the people she had trained. The 10 restaurants did not recover overnight. Some customers returned after the official findings became public, while others remained cautious. Managers rebuilt relationships with regular guests, one conversation at a time. Emily watched the numbers from Japan without pretending the damage had disappeared. She protected her ownership, kept the management structure intact, and used the 3 years to prepare for what would happen when she came home. When Emily finally returned to the United States, she did not announce a grand opening or search for a location for an 11th restaurant. She went straight to the first location she had ever opened. The room was busy, but she could still see areas that needed work. Instead of changing everything at once, she selected that restaurant as the testing ground for the systems she had developed in Japan. The menu was refined first. Several dishes were redesigned around improved preparation techniques, while others were removed because they no longer matched the standard Emily wanted. The kitchen procedures were rewritten so employees could follow them consistently rather than depending on individual habits. Training sessions became more structured, with managers responsible for demonstrating each standard before staff members worked independently. Emily also changed how the restaurants evaluated suppliers. Price was still important, but it was no longer the only consideration. Reliability, handling practices, consistency, and communication became part of the decision. The customer experience received the same attention. Emily wanted guests to feel that every location belonged to the same restaurant group without making each one feel identical. The first location operated under the new system for several months. Emily watched the results closely, listened to employees, reviewed customer feedback, and changed details that were not working. When the process proved reliable, she began introducing the model at the second location. Then the third. Managers from the first restaurant helped train teams at the next locations, creating a system that could spread without Emily personally supervising every shift. Gradually, the changes moved through all 10 restaurants. The response was slow at first, then unmistakable. Regular customers began returning. People who had canceled reservations during the scandal booked tables again. Some recognized Emily when she visited and told her they were glad to see the restaurant operating with confidence again. Employees who had once worried about the future began talking about growth and new training opportunities. The restaurants were not simply surviving anymore. They were developing into the business Emily had originally imagined, now supported by lessons she had gathered across 3 years in Japan. Ryan did not receive the control he had demanded. He had to deal with the consequences of the investigation and the choices he had made, while Emily stopped allowing family expectations to influence business ownership. Her father no longer served as neighborhood association leader, and the family no longer had any authority over what happened to Emily's restaurants. Emily did not need a dramatic confrontation to prove that point. Her decisions had already established the boundary. One evening, after the 10th location had adopted the new operating model, Emily sat with her leadership team and signed a new expansion plan. It was not a plan to grow simply because growth looked impressive. It focused on strengthening the company, developing managers, protecting quality, and expanding only when the systems were ready. When she finished signing, Emily walked to the front window of the first restaurant. Outside, customers were waiting for tables. Some had been coming for years. Others were new. She watched the line move toward the entrance and thought about how different the same business felt after everything that had happened. She had once believed that protecting what she built meant proving herself to the people closest to her. Japan had taught her something more useful. Skill mattered, discipline mattered, and family could matter deeply, but none of those things erased the right to decide what happened to the work she had created. She looked at the dining room, then back at the signed expansion plan. "They thought living under the same roof made my success theirs," Emily said quietly. "It took me 3 years in Japan to understand that family can share a table with you without owning what you built."